I'm going to learn how to drive, he said without looking at her. They were sitting by the small kitchen table next to the window, having a simple meal of soup and bread. Why do you want to learn how to drive? Eva asked. She moved a spoonful of soup towards her mouth. She was slurping because it was hot. It takes a lot of work taking the test, and to be honest, I don't think you have the patience in order to pass it. You're not young anymore either. He was looking out the window. Her slurping was quite loud, and it annoyed him a bit, as it always had done. Maybe she's right, he thought. Maybe I don't have the patience. He moved his head slowly away from the window and towards her. Levi looked at her face. It was pale, and her wrinkles were getting quite deep around her eyes and her mouth. She was still beautiful, but one could tell how she had aged over the last few years. He thought he still loved her, but sometimes he just couldn't understand. He couldn't understand what it was that kept them together. Eva was finishing her soup, and Levi could see an orange line around her mouth. She hadn't noticed it herself and didn't wipe it off. He looked at her mouth but didn't say anything. He almost froze where he sat, staring at that orange bit of soup. Suddenly he took a piece of bread and moved it around his own plate as a sponge to catch the last bits on his plate. Without making a sound. Why do I want to learn how to drive? Levi thought to himself. He didn't really need it. In fact, it would take him longer to get to work if he drove rather than using the train. I'm not sure why I want it, he said to Eva, chewing on the last bit of bread. I just thought it would be good to control a car. Eva looked at him. Her eyes seemed cold. You want to control a car, she suddenly said sarcastically. Is that all there is to it? You would like to control a car? And what is the point of doing that if you don't really need the car as a means to get from A to B? She was getting impatient and had got up from the table. She put the plates in the sink. Levi looked out of the window again and studied his footprints in the snow. Maybe it would be nice to rent a car and drive it in a different country one day, he said without much conviction. Eva was washing the plates and turned towards him with soapy hands. But I thought you always believed that cars are a bad thing, and that you didn't want to be part of the pollution of the planet. This is pointless, he thought to himself. I'm not getting anywhere, and I'm not even sure why I told her. He sighed and took the tobacco and pipe out of his pocket. He watched Eva's body as she was scrubbing the dishes. She was beautiful, and she had a figure of a much younger woman. He suddenly felt detached from her, detached from the kitchen, and from this whole situation. The body of Eva's was a stranger's body. How peculiar it was, this sudden need to drive a car. He didn't think he needed a driving license, but he was convinced that it would be important. Levi puffed on his pipe and kept the smoke in his mouth for a while. It tasted of whiskey, one of his favourite flavours. Would you like a coffee? Eva asked. Levi hesitated for a moment. No, I think I want a whiskey, he replied, and walked over to the drinks cabinet in the living room. He chose a glass with a rough pattern and poured the whiskey into it. 30 years. It was 30 years since they first met. Eva came into the living room and put a couple of logs and some newspaper into the fireplace. She lit the paper with a matchstick and carefully watched how the flame spread around it underneath the logs. Levi thought Eva had never been very good at lighting a fire, but she had always enjoyed sitting there whilst trying to make it burn. It's like meditating, she'd once said. I want to learn how to drive for the same reason as you enjoy lighting the fire, Levi said, without really knowing why he just said that. Eva didn't reply. She just put more and more newspaper into the fireplace until the wood finally caught fire. The smoke was spreading in the room. I think you forgot to open the ventilator, Levi said gently. No, I didn't, Eva said with an irritated voice. I think you must have, Levi said. Otherwise the smoke wouldn't have come into the room. What do you know about it? Lighting fires, Eva said. You never bothered trying, so you don't know enough about it. Levi opened the windows and started coughing. He wanted Eva to figure it out for herself and walked out of the living room. He felt tired. He felt he lacked control in his life. Back in the kitchen, he knocked the old tobacco out of his pipe and filled it up again. He was thinking about Eva, and he wondered if he really knew her properly after all these years. He lost himself in his thoughts for a while. Thoughts about him and Eva when they were young, nostalgic thoughts. He felt profoundly melancholic. When he lit his pipe again, he noticed a strong smell of smoke coming into the kitchen. "Open that damn ventilator," he shouted. There was no response. He turned around and saw black smoke moving towards him. He coughed and found it hard to breathe. Eva is in the smoke, he thought. For a second he was paralyzed. He stood there watching the smoke turning into a big black cloud before he slowly walked backwards through the kitchen and towards the front door. "It would be impossible for me to get through that thick smoke," he said with a quiet voice. "I would choke to death." With a bump he hit the door with his back, and he turned around to open it. Outside the snow was soft and he could feel the cold and wet through his socks. He walked away from the house and towards the neighbour's car. Why had he mentioned to her that he wanted to drive? He didn't know why. All he knew was that he had to get out of the snow and into that car, otherwise his feet would get frostbite.